Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. These are some of the most familiar words Jesus ever spoke. Spoken far and wide, misunderstood far and wide. I really fear sometimes people don't really grasp what he's talking about and what that statement really meant. I see three important things that follow on this narrow part of his statement. One, Jesus' church was not going to be remodeled Judaism. It was not going to be a continuation, a revamping of the Old Testament church. There's an assumption on some parts that the church is a continuum, Old Testament and New Testament. These are not the words that Jesus used to describe this. He says, I will build, future, and it's my church. The language, the way he says this, leads me to believe that he's doing something that is entirely new. To do otherwise would have been to put new wine in old bottles. Second, the word rendered church means assembly. You can't have an assembly of one person. Not possible. You've got to have at least two, preferably three, and preferably more than that before you actually can call the thing a church. Third, if the church is to be built, sooner or later, someone is going to have to lay some bricks. That is unavoidable. And it's on this last point that I want us to reflect today. I think sometimes we look at the work of Jesus as being kind of like a form of magic. All we have to do is come to church, park our carcasses, sing hymns, listen to a sermon, have some cookie, coffee, sandwiches, or whatever afterward, and go home, and that somehow the church will, almost like magic, grow because of the miraculous work that Jesus Christ will do to build his church. But there's something funny also about this statement. The expression about the gates of hell does not mean that a given church can't die. For example, the Corinthian church is no more. It didn't last 100 years after the time that Paul wrote his letter. The church at Philippi disappeared. The church at Troas disappeared. The church at Ephesus, Smyrna, and the Galatian churches all disappeared from the scene. Probably all within the first 100 years after they got their letters. Now, do you think these churches died out because of a failure on Jesus' part? Of course not. That's an absurd thing to say. Well, who failed? Where did the failure come about that these churches ceased to exist? Oh, it's possible, of course, that something could come in and just overwhelm the church and kill them all off. But that's not really what happened. People migrate, people change, but the churches in those places did cease to exist. The church continued someplace else, but in different places. Now, we are here today in this room because of the work of a great cloud of people who went on before us. They did works, great and small, but all those works were, in fact, the work of Christ. They were Christ working in those people who did those things and made those sacrifices that eventually brought this gaggle of people into this room on this day during the Feast of Tabernacles. The Apostle Paul, we all know we owe a debt to him, don't we? Our debt to Paul is mammoth. It's huge because of the writings that he did, the powerful influence he had on the early church. We know that. Now, Paul, though, wrote to the Corinthians in chapter 3, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. He said this, "Who then is Paul? And who is Apollos, but servants by whom you believed, even as the Lord gave to every man? I have planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then," says Paul, "neither he that plants is anything, nor he that waters, but God that gives the increase." So, Paul wrote to the Corinthians that he was nothing. Now, I hope Paul's going to forgive me, but while I can accept that statement at a certain level, I would have to remind him of something he said later in the same letter. It's down in chapter 9, and I'm going to start reading to you from verse 19. And I want you to listen carefully to what he said. First of all, he says, well, I'm nothing. Apollos is nothing. It's God that gives the increase. We all agree. We're happy with that. But listen to what he wrote later. He said in verse 19 of chapter 9, though I be free from all men, I have made myself the servant to all, that I might gain the more. To the Jews, well, I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To those who are under the law, as one who is under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without the law, a bunch of outlaws, I became as an outlaw. Not really, but sort of. That I might gain those who are outlaws. To the weak I became as weak, that I might gain the weak. And then he makes this astonishing statement. I am made all things to all means, that I might by some means save all. Now, you better think that through, because what Paul sits here and telling us, I'm doing what I'm doing so that I could save somebody. Okay, now we begin to get a little bit broader picture of what he means in all of the things he says. Paul firmly believed that he could fail, and that if he failed, people would die. He felt that what he did, his sacrifice, all the suffering, all the pain, all the loss, meant nothing, because what he was after was the souls, the lives, the eternal lives of people who would be in the kingdom of God because of what he did, and who would not be in the kingdom of God if he didn't do it. So, I think we can say safely, Paul believed his work made a difference. It is also clear that he saw it not as his work, but as Christ working in and through him. And this is the crucial thing to understand. It is not that we can do this on our own. We can't. But it is also not that Christ does it over here somewhere and we just sort of watch it happen. Christ in us does these things, and if we won't do them, he probably won't make us do it. Most of us are not like Jonah. So let's not be ungrateful at this stage, and at this pass in the history of the church. And let's give thanks to all the men and all the women of faith who have gone before us. They're bricklayers, all in the building of Christ. We all know the contribution made by the apostles and all those first century Christians and the sacrifices they made. But these are not the only bricklayers that have made a contribution to where we are today, what we know, what we understand, and what we are able to do and to believe. Does the name William Tyndale mean anything to you? Ever heard that fellow's name? What did he do? What made him important in history of things? Well, William Tyndale was born about 1494. They're not sure of the date. He died, they are sure of this date, on September 6, 1536. He was a 16th century Protestant reformer and a scholar who translated the Bible into the early modern English of his day. He brought it right into the vernacular. He wrote what I suppose would be the comparable to the Living Bible, except that really his was a translation, not just a paraphrase. Although a number of partial and complete Old English translations have been made from the 7th century onward, people started working in English in the 7th century, making translations of the Bible into the English of their day. Tyndale's was the first to take advantage of the new medium of print, which allowed for its wide distribution. In 1535, Tyndale was arrested, jailed in the castle of Vilvoorde, outside Brussels, Belgium, for more than a year. He was tried for heresy and treason, and then strangled and burnt at the stake in the castle's courtyard. What do we owe this guy? Well, much of Tyndale's work eventually found its way into the King James Version of the Bible, and which was published in 1611. And while it was nominally the work of 54 independent scholars, it's based primarily on Tyndale's translation. Just out of curiosity, how many of you people are holding right now a King James Version of the Bible? Do we owe this guy anything? It's plain to me we do. I mean, when I first started reading the Bible, it was the only King James was the only guy in town. There were no other Bibles available to me for the longest period of time. And then when somebody did the Revised Standard Version, I remember some preacher saying, well, having the Revised Standard Version is like having a snake in your house. But, you know, that's the thing. But what we have to understand is there was a period of time in which a number of dedicated men believed in the Bible, who gave their lives, actually day by day gave their lives, all their time, their study, their whole heart was in bringing into the language of the people that book as clearly, as accurately, and as honestly as they possibly could. And I don't know that we to this day can tally up all of those who, like Tyndale, lost their lives because the powers that be were afraid of putting the Bible into the hands of dolts like you, fearing that you wouldn't know what to do with it, fearing you would go off in some terrible direction with it. They meant well, I suppose, but, you know, what can I say? Could you think this Protestant scholar might be considered a bricklayer in the house of the Lord? He certainly made a contribution for us. Now, if we turn around, though, and start from the present day, and we begin to work our way backward over the path that led us to where we are here today, we're going to encounter a lot of names, some of them familiar, some of them not familiar at all. I want to introduce you today to a fellow named Horace Driver. Horace is Allie's sister. Brother. He's my brother-in-law. Allie is his sister. When I mustered out of the Navy in 1956, Allie and I returned to Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas. As it happened, Horace, who was single at the time, was working as a railroad telegrapher. Seems like it was about 2 hours away from us down in West Texas there. He had been a Baptist at some time in the past. He had left the Baptist church to join this sect called the Radio Church of God. Some of you may have heard of that. It later became the Worldwide Church of God. Well, I was planning on being a Baptist minister someday. That's why I'd gone to Hardin-Simmons University. And I set out to reconvert Horace back to the faith. He would come up to visit us on a regular basis, and we would sit down and talk about the Bible, and I would ask questions, and I would challenge his beliefs. And sometimes we were up until 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning talking about the Bible and issues of doctrine, belief, and history and prophecy and all these things. Well, obviously, I was not successful at converting him back to the faith. I ended up going to Ambassador College and ended up in the ministry of the Worldwide Church of God, which was renamed from the Radio Church of God. Now, it wasn't that Horace knew the Bible any better than I did. What made the difference is, and it wasn't that he had the doctrines down pat. He certainly didn't. There were lots of times I stumped him, and he said, I'll have to get back to you on that. But he always did. Stubborn young man. What made the difference was that he was right in some important areas, and I wasn't. That's what made the difference. But what really made the difference was his perseverance. The fact that he tried. He gave the answer. He stayed with it. He didn't get mad at me. He didn't give up. He threw up his hands more than once, but he never did really give up. He was ready, willing, and able to talk to me about it as long as I was willing to talk. So I owe a debt to Horace Driver, who is a brick in the Church of God. And if you think CEM has been a blessing to you in some way, you owe Horace a debt as well. Because it is through this path that I have come to be standing here in this pulpit today. If it weren't for him, I might not be here. Now, I understand we could argue, well, God might have called you a different way. Maybe he would. Maybe he would not. How can we know? We really can't. We just know what has happened, and we know the path. Now, it's true that he wasn't the only contributor. But, you know, when you think about this type of thing, you begin to realize that while there are any number of people who make their contribution, there are points, little pivotal points, where if something is missing, the whole thing falls. And for me, Horace Driver might have been the thing that if he had been missing, the whole thing might never have taken place. We can't really know. We just kind of know what our responsibilities are. Now, don't worry, you don't owe him anything that you have to pay. you have to pay it forward. You have to take the responsibility that's come to you from the sacrifice that people before you have made. Some are living, some are dead, and you have a responsibility to carry that forward. Horace is in a nursing home in Gladewater, Texas, suffering from Parkinson's disease now, kind of helpless, but he will be rewarded big time because he stayed faithful and he tried. Now, let me digress for just a moment to point out something else that comes from this particular lesson that might not be obvious. When someone tries to proselyte you, do you get annoyed? Is it kind of aggravating when somebody, you're sitting at a bus stop or you're sitting on a train or somewhere, and somebody said, "Hey, do you know the Lord, brother?" Well, I've had it happen to me on numerous occasions. Of course, I say, yes, I certainly do. And people will do that. But what that person is actually doing is opening the door for you to talk to him. That's what happened to me with Horace. When I challenged him on his beliefs, I opened the door. And you see, once you open the door, air can go out in and out both ways, right? Well, it certainly did in our case and made a big difference. What you need to do is to spend some time getting your story down, Pat, so that when your chance comes, you won't drop the ball. I was listening to the radio the other day, and I heard somebody talking about a sales deal, and what his point was you need to get your spiel, a 2-minute spiel, down pat. You need to practice it. You need to be able to say it naturally. You need to be able to get it exactly right. You need to be able to do it over and over again until you have it right, so that when you encounter a prospective customer, you don't stumble over yourself. You just give him the statement, and off you go. 2 minutes. You ought to do that. You ought to have maybe 1, 2, 3 2-minute statements that you can make if someone opens the door to you, let's say from the perspective of somebody who's out there soul winning for Christ. He doesn't know whether you're a Christian or not. He wants to be sure. And one of the questions you will get from time to time is, "You born again, brother?" And that's a beautiful door. But you got to know how to do it. See? And you need to have thought about it before you get there. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13. Peter writes and says, "Who's going to harm you if you're eager to do good? But even if you should suffer for what is right, you're blessed. Don't fear what they fear. Don't be frightened. But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, as the Lord of your life, the one that you follow no matter where. And always be prepared to give an answer to anyone who asks you the reason for the hope that you have. But do it with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander." Now, that's a real tall order. Let me tell you what the Scripture is so you can read it again and again. 1 Peter 3, verse 13 through 16. 1 Peter 3, verse 13. You need to remember that. Not only that you need to be ready to give the answer, but that you should always do it with gentleness and respect to people. And you may be amazed at what comes of that. Because if you're ready, God can send somebody right by you and cause him to open the door so that you don't even have to. Well, what do you say then when someone says, "Do you know the Lord, brother?" What do you say when someone says, "Are you born again?" Work on it. Know what you're going to say. It can turn you into a bricklayer. And if God happens to send this person to you deliberately, don't let him down. Don't let him down. Jesus Christ in you will build his church out of those bricks that you encounter along the way. Now, I know someone is thinking about how some of those bricks and bricklayers have been a disappointment to us in the past. Yeah, well, nobody's perfect, are they? Of course, some are more imperfect than others, it seems. That's true. And yet they were all bricks and bricklayers in the house of God. When we bought our first house in Tyler, I was interested to learn that the brick veneer on the house was called Old Chicago Used Brick. Wonder how many of you know what that is. I mean, it's a particular kind of brick, Old Chicago Used Brick. It came from a time I don't think necessarily all together in Chicago, of tearing down old buildings. And because many of those old buildings were brick and the brick was painted, a lot of the bricks that came down would be white, some would be black, some would be red. They would have different colors and all in them. What happened was, as those walls came down, they'd hire people to go in there with hammers and little chisels, and they would knock all the masonry off those bricks one at a time and stack them so they could then be used again. They gave a house a remarkable character. They're very attractive, actually. It kept it from being just that funny blank brick wall look that so many houses have got. Some bricks were black, some were white, some were brick-colored, amazingly. But all of them had that rough, weathered look. The edges were not sharp. They had been used before. So when I look at that, they still made a very handsome house. I still prefer that brick and the look of that house to the one we're living in today. Now, the fact that some of our bricks were black doesn't mean they didn't fill their place in their time. We owe them a debt, and we should not trivialize that debt by chipping away at it. Let someone else do that if they feel they must. But for us, I think we should appreciate what has come to us from those old bricklayers. Months ago, I came across an article in the journal First Things that caused me to rethink something. As I said earlier, I think we expect Jesus to act magically in our lives. You know, you go to your bedroom, you want to be praying that God will get you a job, and you get up from the prayer, you expect maybe the phone will ring. Somebody will call and offer you a job, even though you didn't go looking for one. In fact, far more often, God acts in real time and in the person, a real person, rather than by some mumbo-jumbo or some kind of magic. The article postulated, and I thought it was fascinating, that sometimes a prayer is not answered because the Christian who was sent to answer it failed the call. Now, that's something every one of us, when we go to God in prayer, really should take a moment or two to talk to God about. Realizing that He uses us, that He sends us, that He calls us, that He has tasks to be done, and whenever He wants to send bread to a hungry person, how's He going to do it? Is He going to fly it in with a stork? Not likely. He's going to do it by someone who's a bricklayer in his house. Someone who is a worker. Someone who has said, Lord, I will serve you. How can I help? And then He opens a door for you to help. Consider a man named Philip. Philip had a burgeoning evangelistic work going on up in Samaria. You may remember him. He's one of the original deacons that were ordained in the Jerusalem church. Well, this particular one turned out to be a very powerful preacher, and he went off up in Samaria, was baptizing people all over the place. Well, all of a sudden one day, an angel of the Lord spoke to Philip and said, get up, go down to the south to the road that goes from Jerusalem to Gaza, which is desert. It is to Philip's eternal credit that he did not ask what for. I don't think he had a clue. He said, go. Philip says, okay, I'll go. So he arose and went. And behold, a man of Ethiopia, a eunuch of great authority under Candace, the queen of the Ethiopians, had a charge of all her treasure, had come up to Jerusalem to worship. He believed in God. He was returning and sitting in his chariot reading Isaiah the prophet. And the Spirit said to Philip, go near, join yourself to that chariot. And this is interesting. This was the last thing Philip had to be told. He didn't have to tell him how to do it, what to do, or anything else. He got close to the man and heard him reading out of the prophet Isaiah. And Philip asked the eternal question, do you understand what you're reading? I gave this as a sermon once on personal evangelism, and a fellow wrote me later on. He said, the funniest thing happened. I was going into the bank the other day. I had to get to my safe deposit box. I wanted to get something out of it. And as they were taking me through the door into the safe deposit, there's a woman sitting there reading her Bible. And I stopped. And I turned to her because I just heard it in your sermon. And I said, do you understand what you're reading? And she looked at him and said, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. And he sat down and they must have talked for an hour and a half. He has no idea where that conversation went from there. Of course, the Ethiopian did get to baptize. Philip got to baptize the Ethiopian. But after that, He had to let go and had no knowledge of what came of it. But what's it worth to be able to sit down and talk about the Bible and the plan of God to a perfect stranger for an hour and a half, where God may have just put you where He wanted you for the purpose that He had at the time? The Ethiopian merely wanted to understand his Bible. God did not turn some set screws in the man's mind to make him understand the Bible, did He? He sent a real, live person to explain it to him. This is the way God works. And if you're sitting around thinking, well, I hope God will turn some screws in my mind and help me to understand that, you could easily, miss when someone comes along who could actually tell you the answer to what it is that you're asking and want to know. Now, in my case, I didn't even know I needed to understand the Bible better. But God sent Horace Driver to talk to me anyhow. Am I ever glad He did? And Horace actively engaged me in conversation. And that is what you and I are expected to do. Jesus said, I will build my church. But I am looking at the bricklayers, the carpenters, I'm looking at the masons, I'm looking at the glaziers, I'm looking at the roofers out here right now. The people who will build His church, the people through whom He will build His church, whose hands and lips and tongue and eyes He will use to build that church, right there. Sometimes I don't think we understand what's expected of us. That the job is as much ours as it is His. Now, what Horace Driver did is not terribly unlike what a young married couple named Aquila and Priscilla did for Apollos. You'll find that story in Acts the 18th chapter, verse 24. A certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria, an eloquent man, really strong in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus. This man was instructed in the way of the Lord, being fervent in the Spirit, and spoke and taught diligently the things of the Lord, knowing only the baptism of John. Now you look back at that and I think, I knew a lot about the Bible before Horace ever showed up on the doorstep. I knew an awful lot about God. I'd given sermons. I preached from the Bible. I, was a person who understood lots of stuff, but I really only understood the baptism of the Baptists. Well, Priscilla and Aquila, after he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, they took him unto them and expounded to him the way of God more perfectly. Just a couple of ordinary people. It's hard for us to imagine anybody who's named in the Bible as being ordinary, isn't it? But they were just as ordinary as you are. They explained it to him more perfectly. And when he was disposed to pass into Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he was come, he helped them much that had believed through. All of a sudden, that immediate transformation opened the man's mind to all kinds of things. He mightily convinced the Jews, and that publicly, showing by the Scriptures Jesus was the Christ. Now, the article I spoke of earlier opened a whole new line of thought for me. You imagine a poor widow with a couple of children she's struggling to feed and clothe. Imagine she prays for help. In what form is that help most likely to come? You saw this little display up here of the rescue mission here in Fort Walton Beach or in Destin along the beach here. I think it's fascinating what is going on there. And the truth is that these people who are down, who are out, who are in trouble, are looking for help and may pray to God for help, but the help is going to come with, wearing size 12 shoes. It's going to be people who come down there and do that type of thing. But when we think about it, the Scriptures are pretty clear. Jesus said in Matthew 25, verse 34, another well-worn Scripture, then shall the King say to them on the right hand, come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me meat. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And the righteous will say, what? When did we do that? We didn't see you naked. We didn't see that way. And Jesus comes back and says, look, Inasmuch as you have done it to the least of these my brethren, you have done it to me. And whenever you see the pictures of people like this, who are, in trouble and needing of help, if you can understand the fact that Christ says that He is with them, and in that place, if you can just understand that Christ, when He gets ready to send food, clothing, or whatever He needs to send, is not going to do it Himself. Well, He is going to do it Himself. But He's going to do it in you, not by some magical miracle somewhere, sometimes. I think sometimes we fail because we don't think big enough. I think sometimes we fail because we don't think small enough. Because it is in the service to the least of Christ's brethren that we serve Him best. There is no labor too small for Christ. And you just don't know. You have no way of knowing what small thing you do here, what a huge difference it will make down the road. I don't think Horace Driver had a clue the end result of all those hours we spent in Bible study until the wee small hours of the morning. He did it because he loved it, because he enjoyed it. He was having a good time, so was I. But neither he nor I knew where it would go. You just have to understand sometimes that the right work at the right time can have huge impact further on down the road. There is no labor too small for Christ. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 3. He said, "Brethren, I could not address you as spiritual, but as worldly, mere infants in Christ. I gave you milk, not solid food, for you were not yet ready for it." In fact, he said, you're still not ready for it. You are still worldly, for since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, aren't you worldly? Aren't you acting like mere men? Jealousy? Quarreling? Well, we don't have that. For when one says, I follow Paul, another, I follow Apollos, aren't you men, following men? He said, what is Apollos? What is Paul? Only servants by whom you came to believe, as the Lord has assigned to each his task. I have planted the seed, Apollos watered the seed, and God made it grow. So then, neither is he that plants anything, nor he that waters anything. It's God who makes things grow. But then he makes it clear enough, doesn't he, elsewhere? If it is your job to plant, you better plant. If it is your job to water, you better water. And in an awful lot of ways, I find Christian Educational Ministry's job to water. And we are watering broad areas of seed and maybe even doing a little fertilization along the way because it has to be done. But we can't make it happen. We have our job. You've got your job. And in it all, one part of that job is the building of Christ's church. Then Paul says a little later in verse 12, if any man builds on this foundation, which is, of course, Jesus Christ, there can be no other foundation. If any man builds on this foundation using gold, silver, costly stones, or wood, hay, or stubble, his work will be shown for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test the quality of every man's work. Now, apart from, let's say, scaring everybody by saying the fire is going to test your work, let's just stop a little short of that and realize that what he is saying here is there is a distinct difference in the quality of our work depending on how we do it. And we're going to suffer loss if we do slipshod work for Jesus Christ. He expects our best. He's gotten it from an awful lot of people in the past, people who were, I have no idea how many people died trying to bring the Bible to us down through the generations. I don't know what they believed. I don't know all the ramifications of their doctrinal structure. But I will tell you this. God will not forget any of their work. They believed so much in His book, they gave their lives to see to it that it was preserved and passed down through the generations. Now I have to take Paul's meaning in this section. Jesus said, I will build my church. but ours are the hands that He builds with. And the quality and the energy of our work matters. We are Christ at work. We must understand that. A couple of days ago, we sang a lovely hymn. It's number 89 in your hymnal, "The King of Love, My Shepherd Is." As I was listening to us all sing and singing along with you, I was touched deeply by the third stanza of that hymn. "Perverse and foolish, oft I strayed, but yet in love He sought me, and on His shoulder gently laid, and home rejoicing brought me." Beautiful verse. The first time it happened to me, that shoulder felt and smelled a lot like my dad. My dad sang to me when I was a kid. He taught me to sing, and we sang religious songs most all the time of one kind or another. And I came initially to know God and develop my first beginnings of theology from music at the feet of my dad. Another time, the shoulder was soft, smelled of perfume. I think it was my grandma's perfume. She had the softest lap I ever sat on. Marvelous old lady, wonderful person. There were other times the shoulder that carried me was hard, the hands were rough, and it just depends as time goes by how many people pick you up and carry you just a little distance and sometimes hand you off to somebody else. But there is somebody there. And that somebody who is there because Christ moved them to be there for you. You're not going to actually be laid on Jesus' own personal shoulder in this life. But you can be in someone's shoulder whom He is using to reach out and touch you. The way that Jesus chose to place His hand on me was in the person of another man. You should realize it, but for somebody, somewhere, sometime, you may have been that shoulder. You never know. Sometimes, you are the miracle.